Your Royal Highness, thanks for doing this, and most importantly for engaging with the media, the public actually, which is really important. This being Roussy at the heart of Whitehall, I want to focus very much on strategic pictures here. Why hasn't Saudi Arabia responded to what you consider to be an Iranian attack on your oil installations?
Firstly, thank you to Roussy for giving me the opportunity to come, and we'll get straight into it rather than, no point wasting time. I don't like to give lectures and I don't like to be at lectures, so this is a much better format. A lot of people have asked me this question and have been very surprised that we didn't ratchet up the reaction, escalate the conflict, make more of a deal out of it. But frankly speaking, Saudi Arabia does not want to get in a conflict with Iran. I've heard a lot of people say, why are you constantly trying to get in conflict? We have much more to lose than the Iranians. We have much further to fall in a conflict. We can get into more detail on that, but the main reason we have tried to calm things down is that the region needs some more grown-ups in the room, and we have realized that. We're trying to behave more conscientiously, more grown-up, with more responsibility. And the last thing we need is to let things get out of control, because when they get out of control, we've seen what happens everywhere in the region. And not just for the last few years, but the last 15, 20 years.
Well, talking of grown-ups, President Trump said we're locked and loaded. What happened between him saying we're locked and loaded in response to that attack and nothing happening?
To an extent, there's only so much I can say. There's a question much better left for my sister.
Who's the ambassador, Saudi ambassador to Washington? It's in the family.
Unfortunately, so are many other things. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about the president. You know, I'm here in the UK to further relationships with the UK, but I will say that we, locked and loaded came from the, he is a tweet monster, if you like. He loves engaging with people on social media, etc. And I think, he does so very quickly, and sometimes it's just his initial reaction. We, as I said, have been trying to be a calming player in this issue, because I don't think people realize how close we were to significant conflict after the tanker attacks, the initial tanker attacks, because that was, the attack on Aramco was totally out of the blue in our estimation, but that was really out of the blue. We did not expect the Iranians to get involved with that type of attack, to do that sort of thing. That was quite brazen, quite, it's really poking you in the belly. And the attack on Aramco was poking you in the eye. And I think the reason that they're behaving in such a way is that they're really getting squeezed, and they're trying to provoke a reaction or trying to get the rest of the world to step back. And it's in these times that you need to just hold firm. You don't want to be moving forward and increase the heat in the region, but the minute you take a step back is you're showing weakness, and you're creating space for them to move into and vacuum for them to move into. And I hate to talk about Iran in such a way because, and I've said this before, before the revolution, yes, there was a rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran was definitely the more powerful partner and player in that rivalry, but we were friends, we discussed, we got along, we had reasonable discussions. We didn't seek to eliminate each other. And even today, Saudi Arabia does not seek to eliminate Iran. That all seems to be coming one way.
They said the same about you, by the way. What would it take for Saudi Arabia and Iran to mend their differences and essentially cooperate in the region, as President Obama tried rather unsuccessfully to get you to do?
We've tried. If you look at the period from 2005, 2006, even before that, actually, going back a couple of years before that, we had Rafsanjani came to Saudi, Khatami came to Saudi, Ahmadinejad came to Saudi, King Abdullah went to Iran 4 times. Things were looking great. We opened our embassy there again. We took a lot of concrete steps to try and enhance and develop that relationship. It makes no sense. We are not a hegemonic player. We don't want to control the region. In fact, the opposite. We just want people to leave us alone. It just so happens we have two of the most desired things in the world, the holy cities of Islam and oil, both of which we consider an honor, but they are as much a burden as they are a benefit.
Let's turn to Yemen now, if we could, Ambassador. I mean, for what it's worth, my view is that those attacks probably wouldn't have happened had there not been a war in Yemen. I mean, it is a function of that ongoing war which has absolutely devastated that country. And the Crown Prince, Defense Minister, took Saudi Arabia into that war in March 2015. What will it take to finish that war?
My father used to always say, the thing about war is it's your decision to get involved, it's never your decision to get out. You need both sides to play. And if you look at many things have gone wrong. There's nothing that one can do in this life that is going to be perfect all the time, that is going to be without fault, failure, or disaster in some cases. And no war is easy. Wars are very complicated, horrible. Anyone who wishes for war needs to go and see a doctor. We went into Yemen genuinely, whether people believe us or not, in order to try and stop things getting worse. Nobody seemed to care about what was happening in Yemen until we got involved. It wasn't a great place. It hasn't been a great place for a long time. And we may have had a role in that. We may not. Other people may have had a role. The world is a complicated place, but we actively sought to improve the situation in Yemen. We have come to the table with the Houthis a number of times, and it's not us that need to come to the table, it's the Yemenis. They're the parties to the conflict. People often forget about the fact that it's Yemenis fighting each other, and we are trying to support the democratically elected, internationally recognized government. But we are there to support. We have come to the table. We've invited the Houthis for talks. We talked to them in Kuwait. There were a lot of promises that were made, and then they pulled back. Stockholm, we were in Stockholm. It wasn't our discussion. It was, again, between the Yemeni groups and the UN. Promises were made, and nothing happened. Every time we seem to take a step forward in discussion with the Houthi groups and their political arms, we don't seem to have the follow-through. And it goes back to, it's a similar thing to where we have with Iran. The people who want to talk to you can't deliver, and the people who can deliver don't want to talk. And that just seems to be where we are with both those sides. And whether it's the Houthis sort of emulating what the Iranians are doing, and the way I see it, and again, of course, as you said, they say the same. Of course, I would say this, is that we're dealing with a group of people who use subterfuge as part of their political process. And so they will try and get you to back down, calm down, so that they can push more. And at the end of the day, rightly, wrongly, we got fed up of being pushed. We were pushed in Iraq, we were pushed in Syria, we were pushed in Lebanon, pushed in Arabia and Bahrain. There aren't many Saudi spies that are arrested in Tehran or Belgium or Germany or the UK, but there are a hell of a lot of Iranian spies that are arrested in all those places, including Saudi Arabia. They are constantly there doing things, little things, that is making life difficult and complicated and conflict and chaos. They seem to feed off chaos, and I don't know why. I wish I had a good reason and an explanation for it. But we have tried talking to them, and it's got nowhere.
Unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have the Iranian ambassador here who can give a riposte to that, but I'm sure they'd have something interesting to say. Somebody who is in Riyadh today is President Putin. A few years ago, that would have been quite extraordinary, I think, for a Russian president to be getting the highest possible access. Is this a sign of a diversification and possibly even a kind of seismic shift in the kingdom's relations? I mean, you've come under a lot of criticism, both publicly and privately in the West, and we'll come on to Khashoggi in a moment. But does this mean the kingdom is getting closer to Russia and China and moving slowly away from the West?
Well, I mean, we try and avoid seismic shifts in general. Part of the reason Saudi Arabia has survived as a single entity as a functioning government for almost 100 years in the least politically stable part of the world is because we keep managing to do things, and we are generally controlled in the way we deal with everyone around us. I mean, let's not forget, it was the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Saudi Arabia. Many people don't realize that. And we had an open and cordial relationship with the Soviet Union, despite being a communist state, until Stalin's purges. And then we looked at it and said, this is definitely a country we can't deal with. And we didn't have relations with the Soviet Union until Gorbachev. Fast forward to Putin, we have issues. You know, the Russians are supporting Iranians, the Syrians, some, for us, bad players in the region. Does that mean we can't talk to them? Of course not. If you're not talking to people, you're not getting anywhere. And which is, you know, we get asked, why aren't you talking to the Iranians? We have tried it. Why aren't you talking to we have tried it. It's not getting anywhere. There's nothing wrong, and it's not going to cost us anything to talk to the Russians. And to try and bring them over to what we think is credible as a policy for the region. I think they're very involved in Syria. They have an air base, a naval base. They support the Iranians heavily in terms of arms. Will we pivot to one direction or other? I don't think so. I think we live in a world that is much more complicated than the world I grew up in. I'm a Cold War baby, where there were two sides. You were good and bad. You were on the right side or the wrong side, whichever one you were on. And that was the world that I grew up knowing. The world we live in today is fractured, difficult, individual. It's very easy to agree with your enemies. It's very difficult to disagree with your friends. And the world we're living in, and many of the problems that I see Saudi Arabia facing, is because we have a lot of disagreement with our friends. You know, it's easy with your enemies. It's your friends that's the problem. And so we're very happy to engage with everyone who wants to engage with us and try and convince them, let's do this in a better way. You're involved in the region, you're entrenched in the region, let's figure out a way to make this better for everyone, because what we're doing, frankly speaking, is not positive, and it's not going to lead to a solution to the Middle East problems.
It seems incredible to think, but it was only last year that on the other side of the street, the red carpet was out for your Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and indeed as it was in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, in DC, in European capitals, and yet that all changed on October the 2nd last year with the murder in Istanbul of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, you've been very outspoken about this in not taking responsibility, but I wonder if you'd just like to share what you said in the BBC interview with me about this, because let's face it, there was a lot of obfuscation by your country's authorities about what really happened there. You know, there was, I don't know, they put somebody in somebody else's shoes, and there was no, I mean, it was embarrassing pantomime, frankly. What are we to make of the Khashoggi murder?
Well, I'll repeat what I said in the interview with you, is that it's a stain on Saudi society and culture and its people. When I found out what actually happened, I was certainly not proud of the way any Saudi could behave, let alone members of the Saudi government. Part of the reason our reaction was so wild was we couldn't believe it actually happened. I mean, I was an ambassador in Berlin at the time, and when I asked for an update on what happened, you know, clearly the man had disappeared. The knowledge that we had was, yes, he disappeared. He walked out, and we don't know where he is. Once the truth started coming out, I mean, it was a shock to the system. And when you're in shock, sometimes you react poorly. And sadly, I think perhaps our initial reaction was just clouded in this craziness of what happened. Could it actually be these guys did this? And as it turned out, they did. People say, oh, but you've done nothing about it. Well, I would argue differently. I mean, we've got 11 people on trial in Saudi Arabia. And that was very quickly after. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is, you know, the Al-Qaeda planner, is only just about to go on trial 20 years after planning the greatest attack on American soil. You know, we moved fairly swiftly to deal with this. People may disagree with the way we deal with things, but the fact is, this is the way our justice system works. I believe in it. It's not perfect, but find me one that is. We are reacting. We're taking steps to mitigate these kind of things ever happening again. Reorganizing our intelligence services, reorganizing communication lines in the government. We've got investigations into another 14 people, I think. So
Does that include Saud al-Qahtani, who was named by the CIA as one of the most likely suspects?
He's being investigated as well.
At home?
In Saudi, yes.
No, but in his home?
He is in his home. No, right. He's in his home. He was removed from his position, but we have no concrete evidence that has come to light of what he's done, but, there are possible links. But he's not convicted of anything. We have got no definitive evidence that says he is involved. We have tried with our friends in Istanbul or in Ankara to get information, but they won't share with us. They say we won't share with them. It's one of these silly impasses that nobody wants to share with anyone else. We have very little to share with them because what happened in Istanbul, not in Saudi.
So, Ambassador, your appointment here to London, to the Court of St. James, is together with that of your sister to Washington, and it's part of a bigger effort, I think, to explain Saudi Arabia better. And you yourself, I think, have said Saudi Arabia does need to explain itself better. It's one of the least understood and certainly least visited in terms of general visitors, countries in the world. But impressions can only go so far. Ultimately, it comes down to what happens on the ground. Now, I've certainly seen a more open, on the face of it, Saudi Arabia since my last visit. I was there 2 weeks ago. It's already a more open place. But a lot of things are still going on behind the scenes which are rightly condemned by human rights organizations. So let me just ask, the women protesters, why are they still in prison? People like Lujain al-Hathlul.
Well, Lujain is being investigated.
For asking to drive?
No. I can't talk about the details of an investigation as it's running, but when it's done, information will come out. This is a mistake that it's an unfortunate link that people make, not just to her and others, but to a number of issues. Is you take a snapshot picture and you say, this is what this person does, and now they're in jail. They're not in jail because of this thing that they did. There are thousands of women who protested over the last 20 years for women driving. My sister was one of them. None of them are in jail. She and others are being investigated and being held for other things that they did just because they happened to be protesting for greater women's rights does not mean that is why they're in jail. Otherwise, we'd have 20,000 women in jail. My mother, Nujud, my wife, and plenty of other Saudis who want positive change in Saudi. We have the same kind of link that people make with, oh, you arrested an academic. Yes, this was an academic by technical standards, but this is a man who happened to be a religious preacher in a religious university who wants Saudi Arabia to become more Islamic, not less Islamic or less developed, or, you can't just take the snapshot, you've got to take the holistic picture. Now, I will grant you the fact that we haven't released all the information yet because we are investigating. And in the nature of our system, we don't release information about people being investigated until the investigation is done. So I can understand why there's a blank there. And hopefully in time, things will come to light, inshallah.
Let's come on to the changes that MBS Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is pushing in the country. He has done what no previous ruler has done in terms of introducing entertainment, public cinema, allowing women to drive, etc. These big social and cultural changes, not political changes, but social and cultural ones. Why do you think there hasn't been any pushback from the religious fundamentalists? Are they biding their time? Has he bought them off? Are they scared? Are they suddenly converted to cinema?
Well, you've got a lot of elements to this. I think the ultra conservative, it's difficult to know what to call everyone nowadays, the ultra conservative element of Saudi Arabia that is definitely against many of these changes has thinned out quite a lot. We've arrested many of them. We get criticized for, you're not doing enough to counter the ultra-conservatives. We arrest them and throw them in jail. Why have you thrown them in jail? Well, you can only have one or the other. We can't magically change their minds if they don't want to change their minds. Having said that, we have one of the most successful rehabilitation programs from the ultra-conservative extremists who end up becoming violent. They join Daesh, Al-Qaeda. We're in Syria, we're in Iraq, we're in Yemen, we're in Afghanistan, all over the place. 80% of the young men who join these, and women actually, who join these groups come back when we get hold of them. We put them through this. It's a fascinating, you might have seen it, but I'm sure quite a lot of people here haven't seen the center. It's quite a fascinating process of development, of re-engaging them into society and re-explaining what the Quran actually says, what the Prophet actually said. Many of them turn around and say, well, why didn't you teach us this when we were young men? We wouldn't have done what we did. And we're learning from that, and we're trying to change our curriculums, but 20% of them still go back. They're what I call a lost cause. There's nothing you can do about them. No amount of change is going to change these people's point of view. And those people we throw in jail. So you're eliminating, or trying to eliminate, the hardcore virus at its heart. You do that, it spreads less. Even if you don't totally get rid of it, there's less to spread. So that's one. Two, I think a lot of people are sympathetically ultra-conservative in that that's all they know. They've never seen a world otherwise. They've never seen a way of thinking otherwise. And all they need is the chance to see something different. We let women drive, and fire and brimstone hasn't rained down upon Saudi Arabia. The ground hasn't split open and everyone fallen inside. God hasn't, inshallah, la samahallah, let out a scream that has killed millions of Saudis. People are saying you can make these changes and still survive and continue and not lose who you are and your social culture, your religious culture, and be who you are. You let people make their own choices.
It seems to me for quite some time that the biggest challenge the kingdom faces isn't actually Iran, it's not Islamic extremism, it's not Yemen, it's not Daesh, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's employment. It's the massive task of finding jobs for these hundreds of thousands of educated school leavers and university graduates who are pouring onto your job market and in many cases are not actually equipped for the modern marketplace. Now, the Crown Prince has tried to introduce his Vision 2030. Is he going to be able to deliver on the economic front, given the loss of confidence induced by the murder of Khashoggi, a lot of people pulling out of investing in NEOM and 2030, is he still going to be able to deliver on his economic program?
Yes, he has to, otherwise there's no Saudi Arabia. What he saw, and I've said this before, he saw a country that was incredibly successful but was heading straight for a very, very thick, hard wall. And we had realized we were heading for a wall, but we were still discussing how we get around the wall and not taking the steps to slow down or turn around. And we were so close that he had to pull a handbrake, basically. Now, when you often do that, unless you're a skilled driver, you lose control and you probably hit the wall anyway. You just hit it sideways. Exactly, which we're very good at in Saudi. Tafheet, for those who don't know, is the art of spinning your car in circles, which we're very good at in Saudi.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to throw this open to questions now. If you can state your name and your organization, please. That's all on the record, which is good. Sir John Jenkins, former ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I have.
Thank you very much. Your Highness, thank you very much for all of that. Can I ask you about what's happening in northeastern Syria? Can I ask you about what's happening in northeastern Syria with the Turks going in and so forth? I think this is catastrophic, but everything we've seen about the conflict in the region over the last 10 years is Iran gains from it. And it looks to me as if this is going to be the case again, and we are working towards a confrontation between Iran and Israel. Where does Saudi Arabia stand in all of this?
Well, in a sort of vague general sense in diplomatic speak, we don't like it at all. I'll be a little bit more undiplomatic in that I think it's a disaster for the region. Again, if people just look at the region, open their eyes and think through what they're seeing versus using their preconceived notions to come up with a separate analysis, who has benefited from every single disaster in the last 10 years in the Middle East? It ain't Saudi Arabia, that's for sure. Everything we've done, in fact, has been countered in some way. In the things that we've done that have been in the greater interest have been at Saudi Arabia's cost, whether it's money that we've given to friends in the region to help them survive, whether it is trying to control the oil price. We could easily have let the oil price skyrocket and made billions and billions and billions more than what we make. But no, we try and control it because it's not good for the world. If the world gets ill, Saudi Arabia gets ill. We used to say that, my father used to say that about Washington, is that his job in the United States was to stop the United States from getting the cold, because when the US got the cold, we got the flu. It's now a much wider thing. The diseases are much easier spread across the board, and so we need to stop the whole of the region getting a cold, because it always comes back to us. And I'm not saying we're the most altruistic country in the world, but very little is going our way. And I think part of the reason is we are not, as I said earlier, hegemonic. We don't want to control the world. We want everyone to leave us alone, whereas many other players want influence in the region. And it's creating chaos at the end of the day. The last thing we need is another front of chaos in the region, and I think we just got it. How we solve it, I don't know yet. But I wish more people would help us, that's for sure.
I'm hoping some of the ladies in the room I go to a lot of these things, and there are never enough questions from women in the room. So please, if I catch a lady's eye, so to speak, you're going to be next. Lady over here.
Today, I understand. Sorry, my name is Clarice Pastor. I just left the post of head of office in Erbil, Kurdistan, but the Kurdish question has been asked. I have another one, which is about the Russians. So President Putin is, for the European Union, I should have added, sorry. President Putin is in Riyadh today. I am aware of the fact that the Russians have probably developed the most detailed proposal until now when it comes to the so-called regional security architecture, with quite a lot of detailed proposals derived from the OSCE model on confidence-building measures and weapons supervision models, etc. Can you tell us a bit about this and whether this will be discussed today and what you think, if anything, might come out of it? Thank you.
I think I don't have enough detail on it to discuss it in any definitive terms, but I know of it, and it's definitely being discussed. How could you not discuss it? Whether anything comes of it or not is difficult. I think, and it's not a criticism, it's a reality of the world we live in. The two countries that are most involved in the region are the United States and Russia right now. And they're both very different and want very different things out of the region, but they're also very similar. They're very much based on what are their interests, and they're not really particularly focused on anything else. I don't blame them. They're both far away from the region. We're there. Every other detail is incredibly important to us. What happens in the next 40 years is important to us. The next 100 years is important to us. Not just what happens tomorrow or next year, or what it costs to do this for one event, or etc. I think Putin's visit comes at an incredibly useful time, considering what's happening now in northern Syria. Hopefully we can work from whatever formula they may have. I think there is some benefit into bringing the Russians into, not just because they're already in the region, but one of the things we've said for a long time is, the Middle East is not Central Europe or Western Europe or North America. You can't deal with the Middle East the same way you deal with other parts of the world. It's different on so many, culturally, historically. The basis of our culture in Arabia is non-agrarian, which nobody in Europe or North America can possibly comprehend. It's not about land. So we are a very different sort of people. The Russians do, to some extent, understand the East a lot better than the West does. And I think it may be beneficial to have someone from a different point of view. I don't always agree with what the Russians are doing. Then again, I don't always agree with the British or the Americans are doing. So, but getting more people at the table to talk, not too many, because too many voices leads nowhere, unfortunately. A few more different opinions, and if we can just get people to focus on stabilizing the region. You know, I've always believed Saudi Arabia is the economic dynamo of the region at the moment, and if we can get Saudi Arabia really moving and stabilize the rest, the whole region benefits, and then the whole world benefits. And I don't want to talk too in great, using great terminology and vague words, but I really think there's an opportunity out of difficulty to create some positive change. Because I think people are waking up and saying, look, we're fed up of this. This is ridiculous. But we're going to need the rest of the world to help.
Let's take the next question.
James Kidner from Improbable. We're a technology company that does large-scale simulation. Your Honor, thank you for your candor. Can I pick up the point you were saying about different cultures? For 100 years, for all of its existence, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has effectively been able to insulate itself from the sort of effects of globalization and other cultures and taken what it wishes of them. How is it going to be possible to protect that very conservative and deeply rooted society from the excesses of globalization when tourism opens up? I'm not suggesting it's going to become the new Ibiza, but how are we going to defend against some of the excesses of the 21st century?
Very good to see you again. It's a very good question because that's a very long-term question, and it's one that very few people, people always want to ask about the strategic policy, institutions of government, religion, economy, but nobody's thinking about the long-term effect of culture and the social network, because that's a fabric that's kept the country together for the last 100 years. It hasn't just happened because the monarchy has been so perfect it's run the country well. There's been a lot of moving parts to what has kept the country unified. For the first time in its history, Arabia has never been unified. Very briefly under the opening era of Islam, but after that it fell apart again. We are complicated and probably quite annoying people, to be honest, if I'm being honest, but it's a difficult question. We're coming to terms with it. I think in the modern world, with social media, with the smaller world that we live in, and the pace of information. I was thinking the other day, when I was, 14, 15 years old, if I wanted to know the most important thing about my grandmother, it would take me a few days to get that information to me. Right now, I can find out what someone is having for breakfast halfway around the world right now, 2 seconds after they've had it. Something totally insignificant is instant. Information is instant. You can't hide or slow things down, unfortunately, unless there's a world disaster, which I hope there isn't, and I know a lot of people are worried about it around London now, but I think we need to focus on providing people the knowledge of what is their culture, what it means to be a Saudi, what is their tradition, and let them make the decision on where they want to take it. In fact, it was Prince Charles who told me this once. He said, people misunderstand what tradition means. Tradition does not mean holding on to what was. It means taking what was in the spirit of it and applying it to the world you live in. And I think that is a lesson many of us can learn, and particularly us in Saudi who are facing this issue, is to say, look, this is the tradition. Keep it, protect it, but develop it. And I think we're trying to do that, and I think we're doing a good job of it. But at the end of the day, we're just caretakers of that tradition. Someone else's, the next generation must want to keep it. But inevitably, you will lose. That's just the way of things.
Ambassador, I can tell you're on free flow here, which is great, but we've got a lot of, no, it's all right. I might just ask you to keep your answers slightly shorter because we've got a lot of arms up. So, gentleman over here in the red spotty tie. Oh, and then, actually, we'll just go behind you first. Green tie first and then red tie.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. There are rumours of the Houthis. Sorry, James Spencer. From AIG. There are rumours of a peace talk between the Houthis and the Saudis and potentially peace. Are there any plans for the opening up of maritime access points within the Houthi control areas? And if so, what are those arrangements likely to look like?
Well, I mean, we have allowed access much more than people assume that we have. Much of the access that is, particularly at Hodeidah, most of the other ports are in government control and are open. A lot of the blockages that happen with things coming into Hodeidah is not necessarily from our side. We can't get permits from the Houthis who are controlling Hodeidah. There have been times when, and it, based on certain issues and certain information, where we have blockaded the port, but it has not been regular. And when the port was blockaded, we, certainly when it comes to aid, have tried to funnel it in through other areas. We've opened 7 major road networks into Yemen. We've been rebuilding 3 ports so that there can be access, but we can't control everything that goes into Hodeidah, and so when things are particularly difficult, we put a stop to it. But by and large, we are not blockading the port. Much of the problem comes from the Houthi side and not giving permits for ports, and a lot of that is aid. As far as how things will develop, we'll have to wait and see how the Houthis want to deal with us, or the Yemeni government, rather.
Crispin Ellison, member. Your Royal Highness, up until about 3 years ago, the GCC was very much, a way forward, creating an alliance, stability in the region. And then, you fell out with Qatar. Can you say something about that relationship and the way forward for the GCC? Thank you.
Well, I think Qatar fell out with us rather than the other way around. There has been an issue there that goes back, people are only talking about it the last 2 years, but this goes back 15 years. And for 15 years, we have tried to placate, to discuss, to work with the Qataris, and they don't seem to want to work with us. And event after event, thing after thing, annoyance after annoyance, it wasn't just us. A number of us, particularly the 4 countries of the boycott, decided enough's enough. You don't want to be part of the system, then don't. You go your way and we'll go ours. There are more people concerned about Qatar, which is an ultra-wealthy country that seems to, according to their own version of events, has no problem with the boycott. They've survived perfectly fine without us. More people are worried about Qatar, considering it says it has no problem, than anyone cared about Cuba. Cuba was blockaded by the Americans for how long? And it was a poor nation with poor people that had to, create spare parts for cars that had to, and it developed a long way.
If I could just jump in here, I think the point is, though, that the rift between, let's face it, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain on the one hand, and Qatar up on the naughty step, means that the GCC doesn't really exist anymore. It does by name, but Gulf unity is gone, khalas.
It'll definitely come back. The issue with Qatar is it's a particularly difficult issue between family members. We will work it out, but family members, this goes back to what I was saying earlier between countries. It's very easy to agree with your enemies. It's much more difficult to disagree with your friends. And I think Qataris are almost Saudis, and the Saudis are almost Qatari. The fact that we've disagreed hurts a lot more, and therefore is much more difficult to back down from the difficulty. And at the end of the day, we have open arms for the Qataris if they want to come and talk to us. We're not driving them away, they're walking away.
Next question.
شكرا صاحب سمو عليا مبايد Chief Economist for MENA at Jefferies International. I would like to jump on your suggestion that appeasement is the way to go. For us economists, appeasement also in the region means obviously lower geopolitical risk premia that drives oil prices. And there's clearly a tension between trying to move that way and seeing oil prices move further down, and that in itself can be clear challenge for Saudi Arabia, particularly that when we look at how the reform momentum has been going, we have seen some reversals over the last few years in terms of really pushing ahead in trying to adjust to the new normal. So how do you see this tension moving ahead, or do you think that the dividends of appeasement are actually much important?
By appeasement, politically...
With the region, with Iran.
Well, I think appeasement has limits. You know, we have a problem with, this is what I was saying earlier about with Iran. You know, we have pushed to, I think, as far as is possible. Moving backwards and appeasing Iran is a big mistake for us, because then they know where our weakness is. Well, every time we want something, we just have to launch some missiles at an oil facility, or blow up some tankers, or kidnap a tanker, and they'll bend, because they won't react, because we just did the biggest attack on Saudi Arabia and nobody reacted. So the key is not to appease, but it's not to push forward either. I think we're at a fairly difficult place. And by the way, I say this knowing that the country most likely to be negatively affected by this is Saudi Arabia. It's not Washington, it's not London, it's not Berlin, it's not Paris, it ain't Moscow. It's Saudi Arabia that's going to bear the brunt of this. But it's a price that's worth taking. Some things you must stand up and fight for. And if that fighting comes at a cost, so be it, that's life. Life is not easy. It's very difficult. And this is why we're appeasement historically, and there's no need to go into the details, doesn't often work. Very rarely does it work.
Okay.
David Abraham, former Vice President of RUSI. I must be frank with you, your honesty is overwhelming, it's excellent. Thank you very much. My question is about Israel. You're thawing relations on a brighter note with Israel, which is very commendable. We have got the Israel-Palestine situation. You have put a peace initiative forward a considerable number of years ago, which I totally agree with. Can you see any prospects for taking that peace agreement forward with Israel?
I think it would be great. I would just reword the way we do, the way the relationship goes, because for us, it always has been, what is right for the Palestinian people is what is right for Saudi Arabia. And until the Palestinian people say they're happy with us doing something, we will not unilaterally move in a particular direction. Rightly or wrongly, and I've heard lots of arguments either way for that. But it's always been our primary point in our relationship, which is why I'm always fascinated by the criticism Saudi Arabia gets for being too friendly to Israel or too anti-Palestinian. We're the only country that doesn't recognize Israel. We're the only country that goes out of its way to make a point of that. And yet we get criticized for Saudi Arabia may possibly allow Israeli aircraft to flow over the country. Well, look at all the neighbors of Israel who have open relationships and embassies. Why isn't that, criticized? But that's a private point of annoyance to me. But look, there's no question that peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis would dramatically improve the Middle East, dramatically. It is a very difficult issue, though, there's no question. We've been so close to peace so many times, and not just once. I mean, the Saudi peace plan, which King Abdullah pushed, was first suggested in 1982 by King Fahd. And nobody wanted to hear about it in 1982. When King Abdullah pushed it, we pushed it very hard, and I couldn't believe at the time. We were sitting in Saudi saying, why isn't everyone jumping on top of this, on this bandwagon? This is an opportunity to bring the whole of the Middle East. And I remember at the time, my father was very involved, and people said, yeah, but what about the other Arab countries? And Saudi Arabia said, don't you worry about the Arab world. We will bring them. You get the Israelis to agree, we will bring every single one, which I found amazing. We were asking much of the world to convince one country, while we were prepared to convince, not just the Arab world, but the Muslim world.
Can I just jump in there, Ambassador? Because I was at the Arab Summit in Beirut in 2002, where that peace plan, at the time Crown Prince Abdullah peace plan was launched. And it was a massive diplomatic challenge to Israel, to Ariel Sharon. Yeah. But then what happened next was that a number of suicide bombers were sent by Hamas into Israel, and he said, we will never make peace under fire. And that was the end of it for years. Now we're going to have to move on here because I'm going to finish at 3, because I promised I would. We've got time for 2 more questions. Lady over here.
Hello, Your Highness. Catherine Philp from The Times. I'll appreciate the call for brevity. And just across these regional issues we've just been talking about, do you still see the Trump administration as a trustworthy, consistent, and reliable ally? And how would you put Congress in there?
Luckily, I'm not the ambassador to Washington. Look, again, and I don't mean to avoid your question, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to be addressing that issue because I'm not in Washington. And politics, a lot happens behind the scenes, as much happens behind as in front. I'm not privy to all that, even though it's my sister who's ambassador. She doesn't tell me everything, like much of my life. But happy to advise, but very, very difficult to share information. But I think I'll be a little vague, if you don't mind. We are concerned, no question. What has happened in Turkey, in Syria with Turkey and pulling out the troops, it doesn't give one incredible confidence. But then we saw them sending quite a lot of anti-missile batteries to Saudi and some troops to help us manage the northern defenses. It's difficult to judge. I've had no conversation with American government officials, so I don't really know what they're thinking. I know as much as you do. You probably know more about it than I do. So
question here.
Omar Karim, a visiting fellow at RUSI. I would like to ask you about Saudi Arabia's relationship with Turkey. Recently, Saudi Foreign Minister Ibrahim al-Asaf, he visited Cyprus and affirmed support for the sovereignty of the island nation. How do you see Saudi relationship with Turkey progressing, and would Saudi Arabia launch certain other diplomatic ventures that may not go well with Ankara? Thank you.
Well, I mean, frankly speaking, we conduct our policy based on what's right for Saudi Arabia, not Ankara. Ankara has issues with what we're doing. That's Ankara's problem. We have no problem with Turkey. We have no problem with the Turkish government. They seem to have a big problem with us at the moment. I don't know what it is. But you may read between the lines of what they say. We genuinely, and I have a tendency to talk too much. My wife tells me that all the time. So does Frank. We will do what is in the interest of Saudi Arabia and the betterment of the region. If people don't want to play that game, then I would say that the game that they're playing is a nefarious and unfortunately selfish one. That's always been the policy of Saudi Arabia. It will always be the policy of Saudi Arabia, and we hope other people fall into line with where we want to go. But again, we have open ears. If people have better advice, we'll listen.
One quick last question from Ian Black.
Ian Black from the Middle East Centre at LSE. Ambassador, thank you. It was a fascinating tour d'horizon. I wonder, on the question of President Trump and his proposed deal of the century to bring about peace between Israel and the Palestinians, did you ever think in Riyadh that there was any chance of that? And what was the furthest you were prepared to go to make that deal work?
Sorry, which...
So President Trump has been talking about his deal of the century.
Oh, the deal of the century, sorry.
And the Saudi role in that.
Again, I've had no details on what the framework of that deal is. We had some information about the economic aspects in Bahrain of what they wanted, but to my knowledge, I've got no information on what the actual political side of the deal is. I've heard rumors and inferences and suggestions of what might be in it, but I've seen nothing concrete, so it's difficult to have an opinion on something that they won't talk to us about at the moment. They may have had conversations above my head, but I've heard nothing yet. In general, I think a deal would be great, but I can't comment on something I don't know, unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay, well, apologies to many of you who've got your hands up, and sorry that we're not able to fit all of that in. I think the fact that there are so many questions is a tribute to what an interesting and often misunderstood country Saudi Arabia is. There are so many different angles that we could still go down here with this, but the fact that its new ambassador is prepared to take these questions, I think, is really welcome. We've had some interesting ambassadors in the past, Ghazi al-Ghassabi and Prince Turki al-Faisal, and I really hope that this means that there's going to be a new openness at that pile you inhabit in Mayfair, in Curzon Street. So please extend your thanks to the ambassador for taking the questions, and thanks for your time.